Okay, so this is the March Mental Health Board meeting. We're starting early at 4:30 because we have a special presentation. And I'm going to read the standard announcements. The Mental Health Board, who we are. The Sonoma County Mental Health Board is an advisory board of empowered to listen to the concerns of our constituents and to help formulate policies that offer a consistent continuum of care for all those with mental health challenges. We are further empowered to advise the County Board of Supervisors on the mental health system of care. The Mental Health Board mission. The Mental Health Board acts as a community focal point for mental health issues and advocates for the development of a community network to promote the following: coalition building that will create a unified voice to impact public policy and awareness, a wider understanding and knowledge of mental health issues, the integrity of mental health services, involvement of clients and families in mental health planning. The Mental Health Board vision. The Sonoma County Mental Health Board collaborates with the Mental Health Services Division of the Sonoma County Department of Health Services to increase public and professional awareness of persons with mental health challenges and to help eliminate the stigma attached to those mental illnesses. We strive to positively impact the mental health system by listening to public input and working with mental health services to create policy that will offer hope to families and individuals living with mental illness. I'm going to go ahead and do the roll call. We're starting earlier, so there may be people that come in, but I'm going to go ahead. Bob Cobb.
Present.
Peterson, Pierre. Kathy Smith, it's me. Marianne Swanson.
Here.
Patricia Gray. Peter McElweeney is excused. Bob Hales.
Here.
Carol West. Betsy Chavez.
Here.
Michael Johnson. And Anna Nygaard said that she might be a little bit late. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4 of us at this point. I'm going to announce that there are currently 4 vacancies. There are 4 vacancies in the on the Mental Health Board right now in districts 2, 3, 4, and 5. And I don't know, I think that Sherry Wires was planning on attending tonight. She's our longest standing Mental Health Board member. She's been on the board for over 20 years, and she finally decided that she was done. And then I didn't have the list of who's from where. Fran Adams from the Petaluma area had to resign. And then Becky Ennis has been very active on the board, but we realized that her agency actually had a contract with behavioral health, and that's not allowed, so she had to resign. And she asked me to state that that's why she was no longer here. And then Shannon Barton Wren, who's a fairly recent appointee, also resigned. So 2, 3, 4, and 5 have vacancies. Okay, so that still leaves us with 11 members, and which means that we need 6 of us to approve minutes, so we don't have enough people to do that. Tori, do you have the Mental Health Board members flyer? Do you have a copy of that?
I will find it and put it up here.
Okay, perfect. Okay, and nothing like giving you something else to do. Do we have Kate Roberge or another consumer to do the consumer report? I don't see Kate, but it looks like Sean Kelson is present.
Kate's here. She just
Here
has
I
to
am.
unmute.
Oh, hi, Kate.
Yeah, we're having all sorts of technological problems at the moment. Our speaker, Miller Phoenix, who I really hope can speak, is having trouble with the Zoom link, so I'm going to send it to her again. Would it be possible to come back to us in about 5 minutes or so?
I think that would work.
Okie dokie, I'll send it to her right away. Thank you.
Okay. And the Peers Coalition report, I don't see Maria. Is she here? I don't see Maria. So that is not going to happen. Bill, do you have a report of any sort for us?
The director's report?
Yes.
Yeah. So let's see, big news in the comings and goings at Department of Health Services. You may recall from previous conversations that we had a resignation of our manager in the Crisis Stabilization Unit, and Sid McCauley has been filling in there. So, and we have selected a new manager who will begin on April 22nd. So we will introduce her when she is here. Additionally, we had announced earlier that we've recreated 2 section manager positions, an adult section manager, adult services section manager, and a youth and family services section manager. So we have been through the recruitment process, and Karen Salidi has been selected as to be the YFS section manager, and Wendy Wheelwright has been selected to be the adult services section manager. Up to now, Sid McCauley has carried adult services plus forensic plus crisis services. So that those duties have been split now between the 2 of them. So Sid will continue to be the forensic and crisis services section manager. Wendy picks up adult. And then the big news is Barbie Robinson has resigned as the department director and will be leaving in mid-April. We will be without a director for some period of time while they recruit. We don't have any clear direction from the board yet about what they're doing. I think the recommendation has been to have the 2 assistant directors function as interim, Amelia Gabrielle and Tina Rivera. But again, that's for the board to decide. And I think they went into closed session today to figure that out. After that, we continue to move towards, move forward on budget development. The board workshops are scheduled to begin on April 26th. So that's when, excuse me, the board has the first public release of budget proposals, and there are, public discussions with all of the departments about the budget for the next fiscal year. So look forward to those announcements and those meetings for the first detailed information about what will be happening with our budget. We have initiated a substance use disorder services system mapping and planning process. So we have engaged the services of RDA Associates to lead this effort. It'll be a process by which we look at available data and engage, map the current system as it's functioning, and then engage in a series of focus groups over the next 7 months to collect information that will inform the outline of a plan of an expanded SUD system. So this would be the SUD system we would like. And we'll look at that relative to opportunities to join the ODS waiver. So we will look at whether or not the ODS waiver could fund the system we want, and if we are in a position to join the waiver. There is also some additional funds for SUD expansion in Measure O. So we'll learn more about how that funding will be available to us and how it can be used. This plan will inform how that money may be used as well. So I think those are the primary happenings in the Behavioral Health Division right now.
Bill, is the pandemic relief funds, does that have any impact on the budget in the county?
Well, it will on the county. So the county is looking forward to funds that will come to the county. I'm not sure if or how that will come to the Behavioral Health Division. We haven't been involved a lot in generating direct expenses for the county. Most of that's been in the new COVID section that has been involved in testing, response to infections and outbreaks, and now vaccination program. So we'll learn more about that as the state budget develops.
Okay.
There's also a couple of opportunities in the new state budget to apply for competitive grants. For one is for RCF system development, so that's board and cares. The other is for housing and facility development for behavioral health programs. There's $750 million set aside for that. So we are looking forward to information about how to access those funds. We should be having discussions amongst stakeholder groups about what we would want to think about applying for when those funds are available. But I'm looking forward to that being an opportunity to bring some more housing resources to behavioral health this year.
Questions for Bill? Okay, so I see that Michael Johnson has arrived, and that means that we do have the 6 people that we need to vote for approval of the minutes.
Move approval.
Bob?
Move approval.
Bob?
I'll second approval if you're doing a motion. Otherwise, I approve.
I think that I think that Bob Hales did the motion and Bob Cobb seconded. So we're supposed to do a roll call vote. Marianne Swanson.
I will abstain. I missed that meeting. I was in another long obligation most of the day.
Yes, you were. Betsy?
Aye.
Michael?
Aye.
Me? Aye. Okay, so they are approved. Kate Roberge, did your person get their ability to speak together?
I know, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, I can say a few words. Whenever she tries to do the Zoom link, it tells her it's encrypted. So I don't know, but I was going to have Miller Phoenix come today. She's the peer outreach worker for West County Community Services, and she works embedded in the whole person care program. And she is a peer worker who is out on the streets almost all the time, and works with a population of people without homes who have more than one issue, not just not having a home, but it may be chronic illness or addiction issues, but they're people who have additional challenges. And her basic thing is if they don't have an ID, help them get an ID. If they need the ID to get CalFresh, help them get CalFresh, help them get Medi-Cal, help them set things up as well as they can, help prepare them in any way she can for housing when it comes. And she really has a finger on the pulse of what's available when. One of the new things she and another one of our workers, Eric Bame, is doing is they're meeting peers at the jail. They're not, not able at this point to meet every peer, but they're meeting peers as they're getting out of jail. And they're, meeting them and, immediately finding out what their needs are. Often there's a county person there as well who can transport them. So they can be transported, say, to an addiction facility or to Sam Jones, or to not just walking out the door and, having nothing provided. So that's one of her new things. When she realized that, everybody was put in hotels, for COVID, the people without houses were put in hotels and given hotel rooms, which is wonderful. Many of them were out in different places that were kind of not remote, but maybe off the freeway or something. And they were there without cars and without money, and there was no place to get anything to eat. So one of the things Miller figured out, bless her, was she knew who to go to, which was, now their main name escapes me. I can't think of it. I'll think of it in a second. And she's now getting hot meals prepared and taking them to people on a daily basis. She's basically out on the street constantly, helping people, remember to go to the doctor, helping people to, she'll see that somebody needs to go to the doctor and encourage them. And she does a gazillion things, but basically she gives hope every day. And if she's had a rough day where she's, done a lot of things and not necessarily everything has gone as well as she could have planned. But
I don't want to interrupt, but Miller appears to have made it.
I figured it out. I couldn't get on it. I am so sorry.
Okay, I'm done.
I've been so frustrated. It's like,
I'm done, but I took up some of your time. So I told a little bit about what you do. And so, and that you're with Whole Person Care and the meals you do and some of the stuff you do on the street. So I'm going away now.
I apologize for all of you. Anyway, it doesn't matter. So I'm honored to be here. Yes, Whole Person Care is my home base, but I do basic outreach for anybody that's on the street. So it's always interesting. I see that my same folks, they'll cycle out of the jail to the shelter, to the street, and then back. And so Kate gave me a couple of questions that maybe kind of would tie together what a peer outreach worker does within the county. So my role is really support for the people that I have on the street. Whether they're Whole Person Care, I work with Indian Health, I work with North Bay Regional. Catholic Charities is a big one that I partner with. I go out with host with them because we're all doing the same thing with the same clients, just with different support systems. So I guess it's kind of like weaving. I try to take what this person is offering and connecting them with maybe something over there and trying to give it a full picture for the people that are on the street. And it's always interesting when they sweep a camp. I was just in the underpasses today and they're back. So it's kind of like, it feels like it is cyclical, but I've been seeing a lot of successes. And one of the questions Kate has is changes that I've observed. So the changes in whole person care have been great. I can't say enough about Desiree as a manager. She's has implemented so that the process moves a little quicker, that we can bring people through our program and what we say, graduate them to either behavioral health program with the access team or whatever services that are going to be their long-term help. And so as a peer, I'm always supporting whole person care with things like paperwork. These are folks that have an enormous caseload. So when they come into the system, they get an outreach worker and they begin paperwork. And when you end up with a 30 or 40 kind of caseload on that, I can come in and do general assistant paperwork and CalFresh. So there's nuts and bolts that support that whole person care system. And they move from outreach and engagement into case management. And that really is tailored individually for that client. What are their goals? So again, I do some support. I love my phone. I just go doctor's appointments because people oftentimes don't have phones. So doctor's appointments, Social Security appointments, Direct Express. I spent a lot of time today trying to get this guy's card activated so he could get his funding. So it's the million and one little details, and yet it's all for the same support for that.
And
for that
can you mention how it is to be a peer doing that work?
Well, thank you, Kate.
How that works for you?
Yes. A peer listens. I'm a real believer of just listening, because you get a feeling for what that person really wants to do. Little motivational interviewing, kind of getting to them to the point where they're making their own choices for that change, for that direction. So holding space, meeting them where they're at, no judgment, and then just building connection so they start finding their way to where they want to go. They making their own mind up, because you can't should somebody. But when they come up with their own ideas, much more successful. And the success that I've noticed, COVID really kind of put a wrench with other outreach workers. So all of a sudden life changed. And yet with COVID, the hotels opened up, and then there was NCS opened up, and things became more supportive. So I have actually had a number of clients that I never really could have, the program couldn't have moved as far forward as stabilizing them in a hotel and then supporting them and then moving forward with some life choices that they made. So I've got one guy, and he's finally getting medical care that he needs. He's cut down way on his drinking. He's added to his Social Security. So he's really feeling set up for a success. And it's not just a drive-by, he's stabilized and supported and moving forward. So out of COVID, I think the hotels have really made a difference in a lot of people in their stabilization and ability to move forward. think the biggest challenge that I have is having enough treatment centers. When you do motivational interview and you're sitting with, and you hear that change talk and you want to go like, pick them up and put them here in that treatment center, you know, but they're not a lot of beds. And I do believe one of the biggest challenges for anybody working on the streets as outreach is addiction. And that piece, if we could just take that away, boy, I think homelessness would have a whole different look to it. And the importance of having peers, the last question, Kate, is that not only do I support all these other cohorts, but I support my team, whole person care, as the person that continues that connection, the person that touches bases with that person on a regular basis, where with the caseload everybody has, it's really, really difficult. So I'm a continuum of care, I guess, and support. And I listen, and I don't want to say I'm a cheerleader, but I definitely support wholeheartedly these clients on a regular basis within the system. So they're getting peer support specialist interaction along with clinicians and all the other cohorts. So hope I covered everything, Kate.
Sounds great. Miller, we're going to miss you incredibly. Miller is retiring. So we thank you over and over and over.
Yeah, but I got a great replacement that I'm training. He's just really fabulous. So, and of course, if you're going to ask me, I think we need way more peers in whole person care, because again, caseloads are getting, I mean, we're really getting a lot of volume, which is great. But the more peer support, the more of those touches, that continuum of listening and support comes from your peers, because that's what our job is. And that really makes a difference within the program. And I think peers should be in just about every part of the county. And I really appreciate that peer is part of whole person care.
Thanks, Miller.
Thank you for what you do, Miller.
Yeah.
Any
questions?
If anybody has a fast question, but then we have to move on to our special presentation. Okay, so I do have two quick things. Tori, were you able to find that mental health board membership flyer? So Carol revised the flyer. Do you want to talk about it, Tori, or just, basically let us see it?
Am I not showing it? Sorry.
You are showing it. Thank you.
Oh, okay. I thought I had the wrong screen.
No, but
sorry about that.
That you will have to scroll so that we can see all of it. So it's, before it had just the one district, and now it's got the 4 districts, and a quick explanation of what the mental health board does. It says we always need family members and consumers, but also ethnic diversity. And I'm just summarizing. I don't know if everybody actually got this. I looked, down at the bottom, there needs to be a 3 in there. Perfect. So scan it quickly, because I'm going to ask for your approval of it. Shows the openings.
And Tori, can you send this out to us?
Yes, I sure will.
Oh, thank you.
So everybody will get it, but I would like to be able to just send it out to the peer centers, to other other groups that might have people that are interested, to the supervisors. So I'm asking for your approval to distribute the male health board recruitment flyer. Bob Cobb.
I have a question, particularly since it came up with Becky Ennis. Do we need to somehow refer to where certain individuals may not be eligible because of affiliations with contracted county services, or where they be making a decision? I'm not sure how we want to say that succinctly, but we're recruiting pretty heavily, but we want to, for sake of transparency, indicate that certain individuals, because of their positions, might not qualify.
That's a good point.
Yeah,
So I
Kathy,
think,
oh,
yes, Bob.
Kathy, should we indicate how many consumers we need, how many family members, or because we have a lot? That's a group I think is underrepresented.
I think I can draft a letter that addresses that. That's a typical area that's underrepresented. It so happens that we had an extra family member, and we have good consumer representation at the moment. So I think that we have a little bit more leeway, but I can also make up just a single page document that says those two things: board makeup and in conflict. Yes, Bob.
We may be having the appropriate proportions at the moment, but let's say, just for the sake of example, if 4 community members applied for each of the 4 districts, that would throw things off again, correct?
It would.
Okay.
So I can make up a one-pager that lays out the requirements.
Because it might be someone who's a community member that applies and is not accepted just because we don't need another community member, not even
Right.
a person.
Kathy,
Yes.
and I am noticing that we're going into the presenter's time, but I wanted to maybe recommend that we move this item to the executive team meeting, because I do feel there's more conversation to have had about this process, and especially with how Becky Ennis's situation.
And it is only 2 weeks till the executive committee meeting, so we could do that.
That would be great.
Okay, we can go ahead and do that, and I'll work on the other document and get both of them to you. Would you like to, Betsy, introduce our speaker?
Absolutely. Yes. So we have with us tonight a very big treat. We have Doctora Daniela Dominguez, my sister, and she is an assistant professor at the University of San Francisco and the chief executive officer on the Margins. She is a licensed psychologist and professional clinical counselor with a special interest in liberation psychology, anti-racism, migrant justice, and gender and sexuality matters. Previously, her program of research has focused on understanding how Black, Indigenous, and people of color, BIPOC, cope with stress and use specific strategies to draw upon resiliencies to achieve positive health. In 2019, the Society of Counseling Psychologists honored her with the Early Career Award for distinguished professional contributions to counseling psychology. So she is I'm so proud to have her here with us tonight and what she's going to bring to the table. we'll talk about white supremacy and racial trauma. So please, Doctora Daniela Dominguez, take it away.
Thank you so much, Betsy. And by the way, can you see my screen by any chance?
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I just want to do really quick an audio check, and then you could see the presenter slides, correct? I mean, the audience slides, Betsy?
Yes.
Fantastic. And Betsy, do you mind volunteering to let me know if there are any questions from people coming in? I know that the chat was disabled earlier on, so please feel free to direct me to any questions that folks might have. But I do want to, before we get started, to just say how grateful I am for this invitation. Thank you so much for creating this space. And on behalf of our team at Hannah Institute, I want to thank the Mental Health Board for helping me come into this presentation, because I know that we had rescheduled a couple of times because I had previous teaching arrangements. So I want to thank my hermana Betsy for taking care of the logistics for this presentation. She did mention that you all have watched Laura Porter's webinar series on self-healing communities and adverse childhood experiences. So I'm really glad that you have been exposed to that material. And she also mentioned that you wanted to learn a little bit more about racial trauma. And so I am here, and I'm pumped, and I'm excited to discuss racial trauma with you, race-based traumatic stress. And because of the way that this meeting is structured, I do realize that we're going to be focusing quite a lot on psychoeducational didactic information instead of processing. So I would like to invite members of the Mental Health Board to continue processing some of this content, maybe in the form of a retreat, or to engage in smaller team conversations, and so that this content can be processed thoroughly. So are we ready to get started? Thumbs up, we're good to go? All right, okay. So as a storyteller, I like to start my presentations by asking the following questions. So where are we today? Who are we? So who's in the room? And then how are we going to be coming into this presentation as a community? How are we going to engage in conversation and connection? And then what are we going to talk about today so that we can really ground ourselves in the content? So let's start by asking, where are we today? Let's begin by acknowledging where we are. We're occupying the traditional homelands of the Coast Miwok. And so I want to offer my respect to the indigenous people of the land that I am occupying today. I am grateful and really humbled to have the opportunity to facilitate this presentation on this land. But I also acknowledge that my gratitude is just simply not enough. It will never be enough. Today in our county, in Sonoma County and the surrounding areas, I actually live in Marin. Many of our indigenous people, many of our indigenous siblings, some of whom are our friends and our neighbors, continue to face obstacles placed by colonialism, including the way in which our government, the United States government, and also local governments have attempted to assimilate indigenous people into dominant culture. And so I am not acknowledging the land that we're occupying for performative reasons or because we're talking about racial and intergenerational trauma, but because we must be aware of the harmful forces of colonialism and how they shape our actions every day. And we must do this ongoing. I also want to take a moment to honor our community's elders, our healers, to remember the ancestors who have come before us, and the freedom fighters who have really paved the way for us to have these conversations. The ancestors who are making it possible for me as a non-Black Latina to stand in front of you and provide this presentation. And especially I want to acknowledge freedom fighters who have made meaningful change in the face of adversity and in the face of white supremacy. So who are we? Who's coming into this space? And again, I realize that the chat box might be disabled, but I see some folks here on this gallery, and I've been able to kind of read a little bit on you. So if you feel comfortable, just even as panelists, if you can let me know on the chat box, if possible, your name, if you feel comfortable, your pronouns, and where you are joining me from, which district you're joining me from. I would really appreciate that. That way I can read that while I move forward. So about me, Betsy did a beautiful job, my hermana, of introducing me, but I'll tell you a little bit more so that you can get to know me. I am the Marriage and Family Therapy Program Coordinator at the University of San Francisco's Santa Rosa campus. And so I have the privilege of being in Santa Rosa and working there most of the time, and then working in Sonoma Valley with the Hannah Institute. And I also have my own consulting firm. The name I gave it is On the Margins, meaning on the margins of society. I like to stand there. And I identify as a cisgender, queer, non-Black Latina who is trying to engage in anti-racist work. And so with that said, when I say I'm trying to engage in anti-racist work, it's important for me to always underline, and if you've come to my presentations before, you've heard me say this time and time again, that I'm not coming as someone who has everything figured out, you know, as a martyr or as a saint, but rather as someone who is trying to do the deep work within, to try to unlearn some of the painful messages that I have received about who I am, who my people are, who my ancestors are. And in the process of doing that work, and as I continue to do that work, sometimes I make mistakes. And I am sure sometimes you also probably make mistakes when you're talking about race, racism, and racial trauma. And so I'd like to invite you to call me into conversation. If you feel comfortable, you can unmute yourself, or we can also continue having the conversation after today's meeting. So before I move forward, I do want to make two additional points. The first is that I am here to answer your questions. And so please feel free to let me know if there's something that is a little unclear. I am getting paid for this. I am getting compensated for this. And the reason why I say that is because oftentimes I think Black, Indigenous people of color are asked questions about race, racism, microaggressions, and they're not getting paid for it. And so that is often taking an emotional toll on our Black, Indigenous people of color, which I will refer to moving forward as BIPOC. So because I'm here as a trainer, as an educator, please feel free to ask me the questions and try to refrain from asking the same questions to coworkers or colleagues or friends who, on top of managing, you know, multiple demands and responsibilities, they also have to often educate white folks or folks from dominant cultures about what it means to live in bodies of color. And lastly, before I move to the next slide, is that I am someone who benefits from being non-Black, as someone who lives in a society in which white people are elevated as the ideal standard. I have benefited from having lighter skin color. Soy cafecita, right? I'm brown. And so I recognize that my privilege as a non-Black Latina prevents me from ever fully understanding the violence in anti-Black racism and anti-Blackness. So I will be bringing the voices of Black scholars and hope to honor them throughout the presentation. So who are those scholars that I want to give credit to? Some of the voices that I will be bringing into this conversation include those of Isabel Wilkerson, who wrote Caste, Layla Saad, who wrote Neon White Supremacy, Ibram X. Kendi, who wrote How to Be an Anti-Racist, Resmaa Menakem. This book I strongly recommend, especially as we're talking about racial trauma, My Grandmother's Hands. Nicole Hannah-Jones, who is a writer for the New York Times, and she created this project called 1619, which is fantastic. Gloria Anzaldúa, Latinx writer, and Audre Lorde, who is, you know, my ancestor, and I've learned so much from her. So you will see their names referenced throughout the presentation. So who are we, right? We've talked about who I am. I know now a little bit about who you are and who you represent. But who we are is also, we are a family. So I have shared a little bit about my background, and I don't know much about you, but one of the things that we can be confident about is that we are siblings. And this is not, you know, of course, as someone who's spiritual, I often use the word siblings, but this is beyond that. We're talking about on a genetic level, we as humans are 99.7% the same in terms of our DNA. So we are all simply one family. We're siblings who have forgotten who we are. So it is interesting that even though we're 99.7% genetically the same, we persist in overt and unconscious othering. We persist in isolating and segregating. So we must reflect and listen to our thoughts, our feelings, our spirit as to why it is that we continue to do this. And my hope is that you all as a mental health board can freedom dream together about what would it look like if you were able to come together as siblings and represent as you are doing folks while taking into consideration all of the voices and the presence of everybody. So how do we want to do this work? Chicana poet Shari Moraga wrote, "The passage is through, not over, not by or around, but through." So she wasn't playing around. When Shari Moraga was asked, you know, how do you write? How do you think about all of the dense, complex topics that you write about? She said, you just got to do it. You got to show up. So my hope is that we can be very clear and brave and transparent about race, racism, and racial trauma. What do I mean by the passage is through? So we are here all together, and I know that there are some other people here on the Zoom meeting listening to something that is often very uncomfortable to talk about. And we've made it uncomfortable as a society to talk about. So like I said earlier, we are not here to be comfortable. We are here to be brave. We want to show up and be in the space in which we're stretching ourselves. It is in the brave space that growth happens. So the stretch zone, the one that you see on the diagram to the right, is marked by engagement, by learning, by growing, and by nervous excitement. So if you find yourself in the comfort zone, if you feel like you're getting a little distracted, or sometimes you're pulled in different directions, or you're feeling like you're starting to get a little defensive, try to move into the stretch zone and sit with the discomfort. And I'm going to try to do that with you as I present, because we know presenting sometimes about, especially presenting about racism, sometimes it's a little bit difficult. So I want us to underline that uncomfortable for all of us as we sit here today does not necessarily mean unsafe. And sometimes we're led to believe that is the case. Productive discomfort is a discomfort that signals that we are in the process of being and becoming, that we're in the process of something new, and that we are learning. We're learning in pursuit of social transformation. So what I'm about to say, it's really important. And if you can take something from this presentation, it's this, that discomfort is not life-threatening. So when you're having these meetings, just keep in mind that discomfort is not life-threatening. But not talking about race, racism, and racial trauma is. So discomfort is not life-threatening, but not talking about race, racism, and racial trauma is life-threatening. So as we move forward, let's allow ourselves to be uncomfortable. Let's allow ourselves to be in the stretch zone. The forces of doing this work, of being in comfortable spaces, can be very seductive. So to sustain the momentum that we have today, the momentum of today's uprising, it must be uncomfortable for us as non-Black people, for those of us who identify as non-Black on the call, to continue to benefit from racist systems. We must be made uncomfortable, because if we start realizing the discomfort and the violence of the current system, we will change it. So we need to be uncomfortable. And during this presentation, I want us to ask ourselves a tough question. So rather than asking ourselves, how has society caused harm to Black, Indigenous people of color? I want us to ask ourselves, how have I caused harm to my Black, my brown, Indigenous siblings? As you're having meetings together, there are some ground agreements that I would recommend. And also as you're learning about this content today, always consider intention versus impact. Keep in mind that oftentimes our intentions are good. I think that especially if we're doing this kind of work, and you're in a mental health board, that means that you want to be of service, you want to be community engaged. Our intentions are often good, but that doesn't necessarily change the fact that the way that our messages are received might have different consequences, right? So consider that sometimes our intentions are different from the ways in which those messages land. And if we do in fact hurt our siblings, especially those who are Black, Indigenous, people of color, instead of clarifying our intentions, I would recommend that we first acknowledge the consequences of our actions and then try to engage in conversation. Another point as far as ground agreements is to challenge and commit. So do not wait for folks to send you a webinar link to anti-racist, education workshops. Do not wait for your Black, Indigenous friend to tell you about a particular seminar. Do your own work, purchase books, journal, really dig deep, do the deep work within. So Ibram X. Kendi explains that to be a racist or an anti-racist is not who you are, but what you're doing in a particular moment. So I often hear when I'm in Sonoma County in the community and other spaces where I do this work, where people say, I like to think about myself as an anti-racist. Well, my response is, well, I engage in anti-racist work, but I cannot necessarily say that I'm anti-racist, because one minute I could make a racist comment, and the next minute I could make an anti-racist comment. So to be a racist or an anti-racist is not a fixed identity, but it's work that we must be doing constantly. So we need to commit to that work, to constantly think about the biases that might come up for us, moments of prejudice, moments of harm. Just observe that. Notice what sensations come up for you as you are becoming aware that maybe your actions caused harm and pain to others. And a part of also committing is to understand that change fatigue is real, right? I mean, doing this work is hard work. It requires emotional labor. So we need to name it, and we also need to commit to it and move forward. And the last point that I want to make is, as a mental health board, try to do this work on first draft mode. You don't have to have everything figured out. You don't have to necessarily know, all critical race theory and know all of the authors or have read all of the books. Just try to take it day by day, do the deep work, and let people know that you're on first draft mode and that you encourage feedback. Ask people how it is that they experience you, especially as representatives and leaders. Now, it's important for us as we're working on racial trauma also to keep an eye out for a few things, and this in particular goes to my white siblings. We need to be aware of white fragility, white exceptionalism, and white solidarity. And I know that I'm going over a lot of terminology, but I think that this will give you language to when something in particular comes up for you. So if you experience defensiveness, you might call it white fragility. If you experience, beliefs that you are one of the good ones, that might be white exceptionalism. And white solidarity is you coming through for your white siblings when others are calling them out for maybe racist practices. So let me slow down and go over all of those definitions. So white fragility, according to Robin DiAngelo, is that state in which a minimum amount of racial stress becomes intolerable. So basically we get defensive when we are called in or called out for maybe racist practices. And those moves might include, anger or grief or racism or guilt or any of the other types of feelings where once expressed, those functions attempt to reinstate racial equilibrium. So when you're called in and people tell you, what you said was a little racist and you're defensive, that response can reinstate racial equilibrium. And then, like I said, with white exceptionalism, Layla Saad, again, author of Me and White Supremacy, she talks about how this belief pops up and creeps in frequently when we're doing this work. So when we see things on TV, or when we look at statistics, or when specific organizations come on the news for engaging in racist practices, immediately we think, oh my God, I can't believe they did that. And then we separate ourselves from those actions. Or we might think, well, I wouldn't do that. I have a Black friend, or I work at an agency that serves monolingual Spanish speakers, so I'm not racist. To think about yourself as exceptional or as one of the good ones is harming anti-racist work. It's getting in the way of anti-racist work. And then the last point is white solidarity, which involves white people protecting each other, their white privilege, and also not holding accountable for their racism. So let's just pretend that, I'm telling, and I see here Bob and Tori and Bill on the call, what you all just said during the meeting could have landed differently. Maybe it could be understood as racist. And then other folks on the call who are also white identified, if they were to say, no, what Bob and Bill and Tori meant was this, that could be potentially considered white solidarity, instead of just sitting with the discomfort of having that conversation. And then Betsy, just a reminder to let me know if questions come through, please. So what are we going to talk about today? What we're going to talk about today is we'll continue to go over definitions, but pretty much this is a presentation on white supremacy, racial trauma, and a few suggestions on healing practices to recover from it, to restore, to amend. Because this is white supremacy is a system that has inflicted pain, and so a lot of healing will be necessary. And so we first want to understand how it is that this white supremacist structure functions. And I will know that this presentation has been successful for you, and that me coming to visit with you was actually productive if we're able to learn about the relationship between white supremacy and racial trauma, if we can learn how trauma can spread from one body to another in intergenerational ways, and if we can learn specific strategies for healing. And for that point, the third point, learn strategies for healing, I want to be clear that it's not a comprehensive list, and it is not about one educator coming in and saying, I think that you have to do this, but it is about you and your community coming together and figuring out ways in which your own local community can heal from white supremacy and racial trauma. So I want you to think about, and I realize I'm moving quickly through this because I'm supposed to fit into 2 hours, something that I often talk about in the course of an entire course at USF, but I want you to think about, what are you experiencing in your body? What is your biggest fear about discussing race and racism and just even thinking about that? And what would you want to know more about after this presentation so that you as a mental health board can come together and think about, what is the next step in you doing this anti-racist work? So let's start with agenda item number 1. We're going to talk about what is white supremacy, what is race, racism, and racial trauma. So what is white supremacy, which, it's a structure, but white supremacy does not refer to individual white people. So let me repeat that. White supremacy does not refer to individual white people per se, or their individual intentions, but to a political, economic, social system of domination. So we're talking about a political, economic, social system of domination. And this system is based on the historical and current, so today's accumulation of structural power that privileges, centralizes, and elevates white people as a group. So I want us to think about, well, what does white supremacy look like? Usually when we think about white supremacy, we focus on the actions of white supremacists, right? And you could look at the Press Democrat, or you could look at MSNBC, whatever type of news outlet, and you will be able to put your finger on maybe someone who has been described as a white supremacist. There's a particular image that comes to your mind when I say white supremacy. It could be a color, it could be gear, hats, it could be slogans, but rarely do we focus on the actual structure. And what I want to encourage us to do today is to think about white supremacy as a structure. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't pay attention to the actions of white supremacists, but what I am saying is that in addition to paying attention to those actions, we need to understand the context in which those actions are taking place and understand the structure that actually enables that behavior. So I want you to ask yourself, and this is a tough question, so I'm going to ask it slowly. Do current structures in Sonoma County today privilege, and privilege simply means advantage? Do current structures in Sonoma County today advantage, centralize, and elevate white people as a group? So the first thing that comes to your mind, yes or no? And why is that? What is that structure called? If it is a system that elevates, that centralizes, and that privileges a particular racial group, what would that structure be called? Based on the definition of Robin DiAngelo and Isabel Wilkerson and some other folks who are anti-racist scholars, that system would be called white supremacy, right? And so I realize that maybe a lot could be going on through your body. And this is kind of the moment in which people are pulled in different directions. I want you to pay attention to what your body is experiencing right now. What is happening in your body right now as you ask yourself these questions about the social structure in Sonoma County? There will be times when your body will constrict, it will shrink, it will tense, it will clench. And those are trauma responses sometimes, or adaptive responses that come up as a protective mechanism. So when your body constricts, pay attention to that. Oftentimes our body does that to protect us from information or truths that we might encounter. So for white folks, according to racial trauma scholars, they sometimes will say that this constriction happens because there are particular things that come up. So people might think, I don't like where this is going. I didn't sign up for this. Who invited Danny into this room? Why are we talking about white supremacy? It has nothing to do with me. This isn't about Sonoma County. This is something that happens outside of Sonoma County, because in Sonoma County, we do things differently. When this occurs, just notice what you're experiencing without doing anything about it. Don't try to undo the constriction. Don't try to fight your thoughts. Don't try to be protective of me. Just pay attention to it. And for Black, Indigenous people of color, there may be times when your body will experience a sudden shock, or maybe a recognition of understanding, like, yes, right? Like the humming or the yes, I see what you're saying. Things are becoming clearer. This might be followed also by a rush of energy. Maybe some people might experience joy, like, preach, yes, tell Sonoma County that this is a structure of white supremacy, or anger or outrage, or a felt sense of clarity or rightness. Also let yourself experience these sensations, but don't hang on to them. Just let them go. Let them move like a wave through your body, and notice what happens as they arise. So we're going to go deeper, all right? Hang in there, because this information doesn't get easier. So pay attention to those sensations as they come up. White supremacy. Let's look at the United States social structure. And of course, Sonoma County is a part of that structure. And so during this presentation, I would like to argue, like other scholars that I've mentioned already, that we live in a system of white supremacy that is built on stolen land and enslaved labor. So our society today in Sonoma County is shaped by colonialism and enslavement. So if you look at the United States social structure, indigenous genocide and economic enslavement began in the US in 1492. Then in 1619, the first enslaved Africans arrived in the British colony of Virginia. And remember that enslaved Africans were regarded as being of an inferior order, and in fact, altogether unfit to associate with the white race. So they were unfit either in social or political relations. They were so unfit and they were so inferior that they were bought and sold and treated as an ordinary article of merchandise. Isabel Wilkerson calls this social structure a hierarchy of human worth, a caste system. And today, this caste system sets the presumed supremacy of white folks against the presumed inferiority of Black, Indigenous people of color. So as you can see, also from this diagram, we also have undocumented and asylum-seeking communities in the shadows. So they're not even considered citizens, right? They're not entitled or eligible to many of the benefits that we have available for US citizens. So you might be asking or wondering, you know, Danny, like, why are we spending time talking about history? I mean, do I really need to know about settler colonialism and what happened in 1619? I didn't know that this racial trauma presentation was going to be a presentation about history or structures. But the reason why is because our history is intricately connected to the trauma that we see in today's society. The legacies that you see here on this diagram of settler colonialism, slavery, Jim Crow, and white American centuries long economic head start are in large part responsible for the historic and intergenerational trauma that is experienced today. The trauma that has our caseloads as mental health providers absolutely loaded. Trauma is everywhere. And we have to commit to this idea and understand how it is that it's connected to history. These legacies that you see here today on this diagram have also resulted in white citizens' expectations to have, to inherit, and to perform social, political, and economic advantages over Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So because of this structure, oftentimes white folks take for granted their social position in today's society, or they take for granted why it is that as Black, Indigenous people of color, we find ourselves at certain places in society, or why it is that we experience challenges. Nicole Hannah-Jones, the New York Times writer that I was talking about earlier on, who's a producer of the 1619 Project, a podcast that I highly recommend, she explained that we need to talk about history and structure because we don't just inherit the glory of the US, but its wrongs too. And these legacies run very deep. And so it will take every single one of us, every single one of you that I see right now on this Zoom gallery, and everybody who's listening to the call right now, and everyone beyond that, we need an all hands on deck approach to dismantle this structure that has existed for hundreds of years. And that structure is seen today. You just have to open the newspaper. James Baldwin, in other words, also said, history is not the past, it is the present. We carry our history with us. We are our history. And racial trauma and intergenerational trauma speaks to this. That abuse and exploitation that our ancestors experienced is within us, is in our genes. And I will talk about that in just a second. Another way to think about this is to actually think about the word caste, you know, the literal word caste. What do you think when you hear the word caste? I think about place, like theater, right? And Isabel Wilkerson, she asked us to imagine what this caste system does to us as individuals. So imagine that day after day, the curtain rises on this stage of epic proportions, the stage that we call the United States of America. And that this social structure, this stage, has been running for centuries. So all of us as actors on this stage, we wear certain costumes, and we inhabit the roles that our ancestors also inhabited. Basically, the roles that were assigned to them, not that they were innate, but they were told that those were the roles that they needed to have. So in this caste system, she explains, everyone knows who will lead, who's going to take center stage. So imagine what that does to us, to white people, to Black, Indigenous people of color, but also to our children. What happens to us? What happens when we see someone who is not necessarily playing that assigned role, taking on positions of power, maybe like a Black, Indigenous person of color? I can tell you that as a professor, I'm often confused by a student. A week ago, I was at the grocery store and they asked me for help, even though I was shopping there. Those microaggressions, those implicit biases, we try to theorize that, and I've seen that a lot in Sonoma County, that there have been plenty of presentations about implicit bias, and those are very helpful. But we need to understand this structure, why it is that whenever someone has a position of power or is in a different space that is not expected, why it is that people will make assumptions, why it is that people will want to try to control their position. The current system has been constructed to make white people the leads and everyone else inferior. Now, I want to go ahead and play this video, and please, Betsy, let me know if you could hear it. If you can't hear it, I'll stop sharing, please. In this video that I'm about to show you, by the way, I do want to provide a trigger warning. You will see an activist by the name of Kimberly Jones who's talking about the anti-Blackness and state-sanctioned violence that the Black community has experienced in the US. And so I would like you to pay attention to what comes up for you, but also to lean into the discomfort. Take care of yourself because it's a little intense, but we have to do this. We have to understand racial trauma so that we can better equip ourselves to practice genuine allyship and supportive healing. So I'm gonna go ahead and play it, and then Betsy, just let me know.
So I've been seeing a lot of things talking of the people making commentary. Interestingly enough, the ones I've noticed that have been making the commentary are wealthy Black people making the commentary about we should not be rioting, we should not be looting, we should not be tearing up our own communities. And then there's been an argument of the other side of we should be hitting them in the pocket. We should be focusing on the blackout days where we don't spend money. But, you know, I feel like we should do both. And I feel like I support both. And I'll tell you why I support both. I support both because when you have a civil unrest like this, there are three types of people in the streets. There are the protesters, there are the rioters, and there are the looters. The protesters are there because they actually care about what is happening in the community. They want to raise their voices, and they are there strictly to protest. You have the rioters who are angry, who are anarchists, who really just want to shit up, and that's what they're going to do regardless. And then you have the looters, and the looters almost exclusively are just there to do that, to loot. Now, people are like, well, what did you gain? Well, what did you get from looting? I think that as long as we're focusing on the what, we're not focusing on the why. And that's my issue with that. As long as we're focusing on what they're doing, we're not focusing on why they're doing. And some people are like, those aren't people who are legitimately angry about what's happening. Those are people who just want to get stuff. Okay, well then, let's go with that. Let's say that's what it is. Let's ask ourselves why in this country in 2020, the financial gap between poor blacks and the rest of the world is at such a distance that people feel like they're only hope and only opportunity to some of the things that we flaunt and flash in front of them all the time is to walk through a broken glass window and get it. That they are so hopeless that getting that necklace, getting that TV, getting that change, getting that bed, getting that phone, whatever it is that they're going to get, is that in that moment when the riots happen and if they present an opportunity of looting, that's their only opportunity to get it. We need to be questioning that. Why? That poor? Why are people broke? Why are people that food insecure, that clothing insecure, that they feel like they're only shot, that they are shooting their shot by walking through a broken glass window to get what they need? And then people want to talk about, well, there's plenty of people who pull themselves up out of bruise on their own. Why can't they do that? Let me explain to you something about economics in America. And I'm so glad that as a child, I got an opportunity in time at Push where they taught me this, is that we must never forget that economics was the reason that Black people were brought to this country. We came to do the agricultural work in the South and the textile work in the North. Do you understand that? That's what we came to do. We came to do the agricultural work in the South and the textile work in the North. Now, if I right now decided that I wanted to play Monopoly with you, and for 400 rounds of playing Monopoly, I didn't allow you to have any money, I didn't allow you to have anything on the board, I didn't allow for you to have anything. And then we played another 50 rounds of Monopoly, and everything that you gained and you earned while you were playing that round of Monopoly was taken. That was Rosewood. Those are places where we built Black economic wealth, where we were sufficient, where we owned our stores, where we owned our property, and they burned them to the ground. So that's 450 years. So for 400 rounds of Monopoly, you don't get to play at all. Not only do you not get to play, you have to play on the behalf of the person that you're playing against. You have to play and make money and earn wealth for them, and then you have to turn it over to them. So then for 50 years, you finally get a little bit and you're allowed to play. And every time that they don't like the way that you're playing, or that you're catching up, or that you're doing something to be self-sufficient, they burn your game. They burn your cards. They burn your Monopoly money. And then finally at the release and the onset of that, they allow you to play and they say, okay, now you catch up. Now at this point, the only way you're going to catch up in the game is if the person shares the wealth, correct? But what if every time you share the wealth, then there's psychological warfare against you to say, oh, you're an equal opportunity hire. So if I played 400 rounds of Monopoly with you and I had to play and give you every dime that I made, and then for 50 years, every time that I played, if you didn't like what I did, you got to burn it like they did in Tulsa and like they did in Rosewood, how can you win? How can you win? You can't win. The game is fixed. So when they say, why do you burn down the community? Why do you burn down your own neighborhood? It's not ours. We don't own anything. We don't own anything. Trevor Noah said it so beautifully last night. There's a social contract that we all have, that if you steal or if I steal, then the person who is the authority comes in and they fix the situation. But the person who fixes the situation is killing us. So the social contract is broken. And if the social contract is broken, why the f do I give a shit about burning the Football Hall of Fame, about burning?
So stop share. I'm going to stop sharing for just a second so that I could take a look at your faces. I realize that that is intense, true. And I just want you to pay attention to, again, what is happening in your body. What sensations are coming up for you? And if you can just write down the feelings that are coming up for you, and I'm not even going to name them. I just want you to write those words. What is coming up for you? Eric said frustrating, angry, moved, grieved, sadness. Let yourself experience these sensations fully. Don't hang on to them. Let them move into and through your body like a wave, and then let them go. This work is ongoing, so we need to keep going and looking at those sensations and then discharging that energy. And that's why body movement is so important. So as you're listening to me speak, please try to drink water. Please try to take care of yourself, eat some snacks, and definitely engage in body movement, however is most comfortable for you and whatever you feel like you can actually engage in. Okay. I'm going to come back and talk about trauma in a few slides, but I want us to consider, let me go ahead and make this bigger. How do you think that trauma was present in the video that you just watched? Kimberly Jones spoke about abuse and exploitation. What impact does this have on the collective, right? Remember that trauma can not only damage individuals, but it can damage entire communities. It can damage the genes in our cells, and it can damage the communities where we live. And also it can harm our children, because this trauma that we experience, this damage, can be passed down from parent to child and from the child to their child. It is intergenerational. So we will come back to talk about trauma, and we'll discuss race and racism first so that you could have language to understand all of this content. So remember when we talked about that we are siblings, we are one family who has just lost their way and that we need to find our way back to each other? Let's remember that race is a myth. It is scientifically not true. Again, we are genetically the same. But we must also examine, why is it that so much othering is happening? How is it that institutions have profited from dividing us, right? Because there is power in divide and conquer. So why is that? How could we find our way back to each other? The race that we have been assigned or are perceived to belong to. So when people see me and they see my brown skin, some people can predict that I identify as Latinx, right? There's a historic flashcard that my skin color gives to the public. My skin color shows people how I must be treated, where I probably live, what kind of positions I'm expected to hold, whether I belong in a section of town or whether I deserve a seat in a boardroom, whether I will be administered pain relief in a hospital or have clean water in my neighborhood, or whether I'm more likely to be shot by police. All of that based on pigmentation. So when you see me, when you see my race, there are particular associations about who I am and where I belong in that caste system. when people see you, they have specific expectations about where you belong in that social structure. So we need to consider how it is that we are internalizing these messages. Now, we talked about white supremacy, race. Now we have to talk about racism. There are three components to racism. There's advantage, there's prejudice, and there's power. And Robin DiAngelo explains that racism is the foundation of the society we're in. So to simply carry on with absolutely no active interruption of that system is to be complicit with it. And in this way, when we say nice white people, or when people talk about, oh, he's someone who is a white liberal, just he's nice, he's not overtly racist. I don't see necessarily, I'm not exposed to bigotry. When white people are simply being nice, according to Robin DiAngelo, they're being complicit with the system because nice is not good enough. We actually need to dismantle this system. There is no neutral place. So we need to be mindful of our advantage. We need to be mindful of our prejudices. And also we need to be willing to give away control. That accumulation of control that white folks in Sonoma County have, white folks will need to be willing to give some of that control away in order to dismantle these white supremacy systems. Now, what is trauma? So we've gone over a few definitions. Trauma is basically comes from the Greek word meaning wound, and it is an injury. And as we know, sometimes there are injuries to the body, to the mind, and even to the soul, or our ability to relate. So trauma is not necessarily, a disorder, but it is simply a response to events in our life, to traumatic events. So not surprisingly, our body actually enjoys feeling comfort, feeling safe, and survival. That is obvious, right? We like to survive, we like to feel comfortable, we like to feel safe. And it actually, obviously, also dislikes the opposite. It dislikes when stimuli is too much, when stimuli is too fast, or when it happens too soon. So when we talk about trauma, that is our body responding to stimuli that is too much, too fast, too soon. And just like with physical wounding, psychological wounds will require time, attention, care, and self-reflection. And so this presentation on racial trauma will not be enough. We have hundreds of years that have actually created a strong foundation of that white supremacy system. And those legacies will need to be confronted. And so it will take years, decades for us to actually be doing this work. And so that's why we often talk about doing this work as good ancestors. Maybe we will not necessarily see the results that we are hoping for in our lifetime, but we will certainly make things better for our children. And so we need to do this work. And just like when we experience physical wounds, psychological wounds require healing. And so how are we as Sonoma County going to have moments of reconciliation? What kinds of conversations can we have? What kind of work do white people need to do with other white people to be really honest with each other and to ask those tough questions of, hey, are you willing to give some of that control away? What does that mean? What does that look like? When Danny says, be willing to surrender some of that control, what is she implying? White people need to feel comfortable first having conversations with other white people. Because oftentimes what will happen is when Black, Indigenous people of color come together with white folks, Black, Indigenous people of color sometimes feel like we have to educate. And sometimes white folks are not necessarily not willing, but uncomfortable doing the work in the presence of Black, Indigenous people of color. So we need to have affinity groups. White people need to do the work together. So again, as a summary, trauma can damage the genes. Trauma can be intergenerational, multi-generational. But also when we work on our emotional health, resilience can also be passed down. So healthier genes can also be passed down. So not everything is tragic. You know, we're not just simply going to be always impacted by this work. If we are trauma informed, if we are trauma responsive, if we do this work, generations will benefit from that. Now you might be thinking, how does this apply to me if I am white identified? How did trauma make its way to the US from Europe? Again, going back to history. For thousands of years, white bodies were tortured, were abused, were enslaved, and conquered by powerful white bodies. So essentially, elite white bodies, abused, enslaved, and tortured, working white bodies. So white folks are also dealing with their own intergenerational trauma. Those who came to the US, who were they? For the most part, we know that the white folks who came to the US were people who were fleeing from brutality, from poverty, from starvation, from the Great Plague, right? So if we trace trauma, trauma was passed down from one European body to another European body during the Middle Ages, and then it was imported to the New World by colonists. And after it was imported, then it was passed down by many generations of descendants, right? So it is not just Black, Indigenous people of color working through intergenerational trauma. We need to do that work together, but also in our own affinity groups, as mentioned previously. So to keep it very simple, what white bodies did to Black bodies, they did to other white bodies first. So let me repeat that. What white bodies did to Black bodies, they did to other white bodies first. And that's where it was learned. White people learned how to torture, how to abuse from other white people. So let's sit with that for just a second. This is why we all need to rely on programs like trauma-informed care programs. And I know Betsy's here, she does some wonderful trainings on that, but we need to understand how trauma functions. So what is involved when we're talking about trauma? Now we're gonna get a little bit to the sciencey part, but we're gonna keep it really simple because I know that you've already watched some webinars on trauma-informed care and adverse experiences. When we speak about trauma, we said we're speaking about an injury, right? A wound. This is what needs to happen for trauma to embed in our bodies, because where trauma is located is in our bodies. So this is what needs to happen. Our lizard brain, while we're walking through spaces, or our reptilian brain, starts scanning. It basically goes through motions and it scans. It scans all input and then it responds. And it responds in a fraction of a second. So it doesn't take a lot of time. It's just really quickly. It responds by either letting input enter the cortex, which is higher areas of the brain, not necessarily the reptilian brain, which is here in the base of the brain, or it rejects stimuli, again, in a fraction of a second. When it rejects it, it could incite a fight, flee, or freeze response. So fight, escape, or freeze. So the mechanism that allows our lizard brain to override our thinking brain happens when we experience real or imagined danger. So the response is the same, even if it's just imagined. If we're scanning, if our lizard brain's scanning and it detects danger, even if it's not there, even if it's not real, if we perceive it, there will be a traumatic response, or what we call a trauma response. And the reptilian brain, this lizard brain, works in collaboration with the vagus nerve. And again, they tag team at lightning speed. So it happens super quickly. And the vagus nerve, as you can see from the little diagram that I have there, is simply a complex system of nerves that connects the reptilian, so the brainstem, the pharynx, the heart, the lungs, the stomach, and the spine. And so neuroscientists also call the vagus nerve also the wandering nerve. So just to remember, the reptilian brain and the vagus nerve are the ones responsible for embedding the reflexive trauma response. So if we want to work through trauma, we need to work with our vagus nerve. And I will talk about that in just a second. So when our lizard brain is scanning all input, and it's thinking about, like, it's not even thinking, right? But it's actually responding. It may react inappropriately or make wrong inferences. Again, it's not necessarily higher functioning areas. It's not necessarily the cortex that we're talking about. We're talking about the reptilian brain, the lizard brain. And it is very easy for it to make inaccurate conclusions or to make inferences. And these inappropriate responses from the lizard brain, which a lot of people call blind spots or unconscious biases, are often exposed to racist messages that we've internalized. And so what are some of the racist messages that we've internalized? Some of those messages might be Black and brown bodies are dangerous and threatening. Black and brown bodies are hypersexual, or they're impervious to pain. Maybe they're dirty. So when we encounter a stranger, when we're walking around, you're walking around Sonoma County and you encounter a stranger, your lizard brain begins to scan for danger. So in essence, what your lizard brain is doing is assessing how closely does this body match mine. Within this caste system, how closely does that body match my body? And our lizard brain will respond in basically a couple of different ways, right? It will relax if it feels safe, or it will constrict if it feels danger. So as I mentioned before, one of the main purposes of your vagus nerve or the wandering nerve is to receive fight, flee, or freeze messages from your lizard brain, but also to spread it through the rest of the body. At the same time, and we'll talk about this in just a second, another purpose of the vagus nerve is to receive and spread the opposite message. So it can help us relax too. So if you're feeling safe, you can relax, but you can also communicate that to the people who are around you. Keep in mind though that Black, Indigenous people of color will not relax based on the words of someone who is a white identified stranger just because of legacies and history, but they will relax based on white people's anti-racist actions. So words are not enough, actions are. So in a video that I'm about to show you, you will see Brian Stevenson and Isabel Wilkerson talking about the harm of people making inferences about others. So again, that lizard brain jumping to wrong conclusions, in other words, unconscious biases, and how it can create psychological trauma in others. So let's watch.
About your experience, if you wouldn't mind.
Oh no, I'd be happy to. No, we were talking beforehand because I so identified with all these multiple moments because I've argued a bunch of cases at the U.S. Supreme Court, and I often talk about having just won this case where we were able to persuade the court that they can no longer sentence children to life without parole who've been convicted of non-homicides. And because we were doing these cases all over the country, I was actually representing dozens of kids in Iowa and Nebraska, and going to these courtrooms I'd never been to before. And I actually went to a courtroom in the Midwest, not the Deep South. And I had my suit and tie on. And I think, like you, I've been basically oriented to overperform. So I always get there early. Mm-hmm. And I was sitting at defense counsel's table, and the judge walked in. And when he saw me sitting there, he got angry. And he said, hey, you get back out there in the hallway. You wait until your lawyer gets here. I don't want any defendants sitting in my courtroom without their lawyer. And I had to apologize. I said, so I'm sorry, Your Honor. I didn't introduce myself. I'm Brian Stevenson. I'm the lawyer. And the judge started laughing, and the prosecutor started laughing. And I made myself laugh because I didn't want to disadvantage my client, yes, who was facing life without parole. I knew he was more vulnerable than I was. So I made myself laugh. And we did the hearing. And what I was sharing with Isabel earlier is that when I got in the car, I actually thought about the fact I've argued these cases at the U.S. Supreme Court. I've got this Harvard Law degree. I've got all these other things, and I'm still required to laugh at my own humiliation. And there is something important about recognizing that reality that experience? And in fact, it leads me to this question I wanted to ask you. You have this unbelievable story. It comes right at the end of your pillars section. I was absolutely blown away by this. And you talked about how at the end of World War II, the public school district in Columbus, Ohio, decided to hold an essay contest, challenging students to consider the question, what to do with Hitler after the war. Absolutely blew me away. It was the spring of 1944, the same year that a black boy was forced to jump to his death in front of his stricken father over the Christmas card the boy had sent to a white girl at work. You talked about that earlier, another powerful story. But in that atmosphere, you write, a 16-year-old African-American girl thought about what should befall Hitler. And she won the student contest with a single sentence, put him in black skin and let him live the rest of his life in America.
So let's try to apply what we just heard, which every single time I hear that, I experience constriction in my body. Let's look at the trauma response, right? When Brian Stevenson was confronted by the judge, think about what his reptilian brain, what his lizard brain may have done, right? He is coming across someone who's in a position of authority. The reptilian brain is scanning stimuli, trying to think about, do I feel safe? Do I feel like I might potentially be in danger? And in a fraction of a second, he made a particular determination. He behaved in a particular way after asking the question, is it dangerous or is it safe? He talked about how he was afraid that if he said something that he would disadvantage his client. And we know that at that point in time, those types of judgments are actually happening in higher areas of the brain. But when we're talking about immediate lightning speed responses, he made a determination, right? Have you found yourself in situations like that, where you knew that what you were experiencing was racist, where you were exposed to anti-Blackness, and based on a lizard brain response that told you, you know what, maybe it won't be safe for you to speak up, to advocate for yourself, you decided to silence yourself. What does that do to the body? What does it do to the body when we're constantly bottling all of that up? Experiencing microaggressions after microaggressions after microaggressions. Again, that is the reason why trauma-informed care is so important and discharging all of that energy. Racial trauma is simply, it's a term that we use to refer to the mental and emotional injury caused by encounters with racial bias, ethnic discrimination, racism, and hate crimes within a system of white supremacy. So it's basically trauma responses that happen as a result of racial bias, ethnic discrimination, racism, and hate crimes. As simple as that. It's also known as race-based traumatic stress. So what happens if trauma is not addressed? This part is really important. So I'm gonna go ahead and read it slowly. And after this, we're gonna move in the direction of talking a little bit about how do we heal from this. Not addressing trauma leads to extreme reactions or unhealthy strategies. Not addressing trauma leads to extreme reactions or unhealthy strategies. And over time, these repeated unhealthy strategies can be internalized and they can end up appearing as personality, right? So if I am someone who feels like I'm constantly having to silence myself time and time again, could that potentially be considered as a personality trait? Will people experience me as shy? What if I withdraw? What if my family does that because we feel like we have to be in the shadows? Maybe we're undocumented. How are people experiencing us? How does that become culture? How do these trauma responses end up being interpreted as culture? So I'm going to underline that. Over time, our strategies to cope with trauma can appear to others as culture. And so we have to be mindful of that. All right, one last video and we'll jump on healing suggestions. And in this video, I really want you to pay attention to how it is that sometimes our behaviors can be a result of these trauma responses.
Slave syndrome is an explanatory theory that really looks at multi-generational trauma. One of the things that's difficult for people is their first response is, oh my God, that happened so long ago. We're talking about people being captured, shipped, sold, beaten, raped, experimented on. And then you have to ask the question, did the trauma continue? Yes. So 300 years of trauma, no help, freed, no help, more trauma. If it's a sustained trauma, then the impact of that is also sustained. When we look at multi-generational trauma, we're looking at people who are maybe victims of natural disasters and their families and their children, and generations of folks who have experienced war. And we know that there are residual mental, emotional, traumatic impact. And what I did was I started to look at the African-American experience, starting with slavery, as a real clear, long enduring trauma. So I started to see that there were clear connections between that survival behavior and contemporary living in African-American experience. I started to see common behaviors that I took for granted as, well, cultural. There's adaptive behaviors, survival behaviors. Well, what are they? Let's just say 2019, you have a Black mother and a white mother. The sons go to school together. They find themselves at a meeting. The Black mother leans over to the white mother and says, I just wanted to mention to you that I noticed that your son is really doing quite well. And the white mother's response is, oh, thank you. She begins to go on and on about, he won the science fair, his uncle's an astronaut. She's just oozing. She realizes the Black mother's son is actually excelling her son. And she says, well, wait a minute. Your son's the one that's really coming along. And the Black mother responds, oh my God, he's a handful, but oh, he just works my nerves. Now, when I'm working with African-American people, it doesn't matter what the audience is. It doesn't matter what class. If I were to ask, is she very proud while she's saying those denigrating things? And everybody laughs and goes, of course, there's a secret. Because everybody Black knows that even though the Black mother is going, oh my God, she's really proud. So now let's roll that scene back 300 years. And let's say this Black mother is working in the fields and a white slave owner comes through and says, wow, that boy is really coming along. What is she gonna say? No, he's not. He's stupid. He's shiftless. He can't work because I don't want you to sell him. So I denigrate them to protect them. That is called appropriate adaptation when living in a hostile environment. The little white boy, say Timmy, he feels really comfortable and happy about what his mom just said about him. And Trey looks at his mom and wonders, why can't you be proud of me? Because he doesn't understand the secret yet. And by the time he learns the secret, he will have already been injured by it. Post-traumatic slave syndrome. PTSD is post-traumatic slave syndrome is an explanatory theory that really looks at multi-generational trauma.
Okay. So let's go ahead and let me go ahead and share my screen again. Okay. So let me share my presentation over here. Okay, now we're gonna get to the second part of our agenda, which is how do we move forward? And this is a part of the presentation where, oftentimes, and Betsy and I have discussed this, where, people really wanna know, and of course, this comes from a place of good intentions. Like, we wanna list, we wanna figure out a way that we can, maybe steps that we can follow so that we can truly engage in anti-racist practices. And the reality is that there is no list. There is no comprehensive list. So we have to come together again as a community and figure this out. But I do think that I have maybe a few suggestions that I could share. I kind of grounded myself by thinking about, well, what is healing? When people say we need to heal from racial trauma, what does that mean? What does healing mean? And according to the dictionary, it means growing sound, getting well, and mending. And I really focused on that word, mending. How do people mend? Think about even in your own family systems. How have you been able to mend relationships? How have you been able to overcome moments of stress with family members? For me, I've realized that it's when we tell the truth, when people can really know where it is that you're standing, when people can know that you're genuine. For healing to happen in Sonoma County, we need to tell the truth about our social hierarchy. We can't use coded language to say the truth. Too many presentations on implicit bias happened in Sonoma County, and those are great, but few actually spoke about white supremacy. So we need to name it. The structure of our society is a structure that has been shaped by white supremacy. And we need to be honest about the harms that have been perpetrated against Black, Indigenous people of color in our communities. If you just drive through Sonoma Valley, that drive that I take sometimes when I go to Hannah Institute, I can tell who's working the land. The people who are working the land are the same people who cannot afford their homes. The people who are cleaning those homes are the same people who cannot afford their homes. How is that possible? We need to be honest. This has nothing to do with individual responsibility and whether people, for instance, the Portrait of Sonoma, wonderful report, but it focuses on educational attainment and, disparities and access. And you come up with all of these stats. And as a Latina, I have to be honest, sometimes I wonder, well, man, it doesn't feel good to look at all of these reports and see how it is that we're constantly struggling. What I want to hear is, how come? How come it is that we're struggling? How does this structure have to do with the fact that our children are not necessarily getting into college at the same rates? How come our families are struggling with health concerns because of fertilizers and pesticides? Like, let's just talk about the truth. What are the mechanisms that are being used to exploit and to dispose of BIPOC bodies? It is very easy for us as Latinx people, as Black people, Indigenous people to internalize these challenges as personal failures. So if you think about our children, if they're coming across those reports, what are they thinking about? Again, don't tell people that you are creating safe environments. Actually create safe environments. And this is not only for white people, this is for non-Black people in general. How have Latinos been complicit in anti-Blackness in Sonoma County? Let's not say that our society, strives for safer practices if people are still, afraid of going into certain spaces. Let's be honest. Healing starts with the truth. And a part of telling people the truth involves being honest with our children. If we tell our children, you can do anything, that will not work. When we learn that only 11% of elected officials in Sonoma County are Latinx, you telling me that I can do anything will not work. What will work is if I actually see people in positions of power. I can see myself when I see a Betsy Chavez. I can see myself when I see a Veronica Vences or, a Nana Lugo or people in positions of power that I could be like, yeah, I can do that. So tell the truth. The second is the social hierarchy in the US is a racial caste system. So it is a caste system, but in particular, this caste system has been constructed because of race. So for systems change to happen, we must center race in all of our actions. So everything we do, every decision we make, we have to think about race. If white supremacy is a system that privileges, centralizes, and elevates white people as a group, then how do we dismantle white supremacy? I would say it's not, obviously the process is not simple, but we just have to think about how do we privilege, centralize, and elevate Black, Indigenous people of color? And we need to do this long term because, again, the legacies of abuse run very deep. So invest in BIPOC communities, and that should be our #1 priority. We cannot think about investment in terms of equality, right? Where we're thinking the same for everybody. We cannot think about investment in terms of equity. We need to think about how do we find our way outside of this current structure. If you look at my little on the margins for my consulting from the little logo, what I wanted to convey is we actually want to break out of the current system and create a new system, a system that focuses on liberation. How could we create systems where all of us as siblings feel liberated? Also relinquish power. And I don't mean don't feel empowered, but what I mean by power, I mean control. Powerful actors will have to relinquish their outsized influence on decision-making for justice to take place. So if you find yourself in a position of leadership, how could you actually throw the table, right? Because we always say we want people to come to the table. Well, the table is actually structured in a way where some people are left outside, right? It excludes people. So how could we just simply listen and listen actively and share and give and relinquish control? How do we actually give control to the people who are on the margins of society? Let Black, Indigenous people of color lead. Create a village. Let's create a network of individuals that will support, guide, and protect its members. I think that when I do presentations like this, people might think, man, Danny, she needs to work through her anger against white folks. And, maybe I do. Maybe I need to work through some of that anger. But, I have been absolutely moved in the past year by not allies. We don't like that term because that's a fixed identity, right? But by people who are actually saying, you know what, Danny, I know that you've been doing this anti-racist work. We know that requires a lot of emotional labor. I got you. What do you need? That is allyship, not necessarily saying, but what can I take from you? How can I give you control? How can I take maybe some of the stress that you're experiencing? How could we do that with others? And if you're a person who identifies as a Black, Indigenous person of color, this is so critical. How do you create a professional family, a personal family, families of choice where people will, be your ride or die, be right there for you? Movement building and activism is another recommendation that I have for you. We got to speak up and firmly stand against white supremacy. And I believe that if enough people do the same thing over and over again, if we do it enough times, eventually it will become culture. So if Kathy, if Bill, if Bob, if Tori, Michael, Robert, everybody on the call, if we all call out, reject, and undermine white supremacy, then culture change can happen. So who are the culture shapers in the room? And how could we collaborate together? For you all, and especially for, again, my Black, Indigenous people of color on the call, we have to understand our greatness, because time, energy, and money has been spent on degrading who we are, on telling us that we are inferior, that we are on lower positions on that social hierarchy. And we need to come to understand ourselves as truly worthy. And I see this also as a professor where pretty much all of my students at some point struggle a little bit with starting their clinical practice, especially their early career, but specifically with my students of color, man, their imposter syndrome is high. So how could we work on understanding our greatness, understanding that source of power? How could we invest in youth development programs? where we're not simply, discussing skills like math and science, but we're actually talking about meaning making, history, who we are as people, our heritage. So rather than allow our children to be socialized by a racist society, all of us have to be really conscious and deliberate about educating and socializing them to understand their inherent worth. And it's not just children. As adults, we also have to do that. I deal with that imposter syndrome, man, all the time. And then storytell. So how could we create rites of passage in our own families where, I have to be honest, in my family, we don't talk a lot about the trauma that we've experienced, the intergenerational trauma that we've experienced. I think out of fear that it will trigger something, or that it will activate us, or that we will come to learn something that will get in the way of us succeeding. And we know that silencing, and we know that not talking about it actually embeds trauma. So as families, how could we find ourselves in spaces where we are engaging in those conversations? And then two more, I'm just going to give two more, pieces of recommendations, and then I'll open it up for questions. And then the usual, right, which you often hear in trauma-informed care presentations, we got a self-care. And I feel like sometimes this is where a psychologist, we stop. We all only say, let's self-care, and we forget about the sociocultural and political stressors that sometimes get in the way of our health. So we need to do both, dismantle the current system, but also take care of ourselves. Got to get enough sleep, good nutrition, drinking enough water. We need to exercise to discharge all of the energy, and enjoy the simple pleasures in life. And we need to settle into our bodies. As Black, Indigenous people of color, we need to go back to our roots and figure out how can we discharge our energy using culturally responsive practices. How could we drum? How could we stomp? How could we move? How could we sing? How could we shout? And actually discharge all of the energy that we have inside ourselves. Let's use our voice. And that is it as far as didactic information. I want to go ahead and open it up for questions and see if you all have any comments, see how I can support some processing here. Do we have any questions, Betsy?
I have some comments. So Elizabeth, who's one of our attendees, is saying, really enjoyed the video that you shared earlier. I think it was for the first video, stating this is education that needs to be delivered all over this country over and over and over. And then, so I have identified the first and the last video to share with the group, but I don't have the middle video, if you don't mind sharing that with us.
Of course, I'll definitely share it with you in just a minute.
And then Kathy adds, I'm thinking about my own history and the role my ancestors had in it, looking for the way forward. So that was a comment to something you presented earlier. So those are comments. I don't know if you want to elaborate, Kathy.
Well, I can say something. I am putting myself out very publicly here, but I am willing to. I have looked at my own history. I realized in some of my family, story research that I've done, that my ancestors they were never the rich people. They were, but they always took advantage of what was offered. That put them in the position of being probably unknowing oppressors. If I look back at where they were when they were there, it's, you know, it's a little embarrassing when I really think about it, what they were doing, but I know that they were doing it. They were doing it because they didn't have land and they needed a place to be and that sort of thing. So, but they ended up being like, you know, in places where you look back now and things were, they were probably not on the right side of history. But I also, you know, the whole thing brought up all sorts of things for me. I am losing a little bit of my train of thought, but I'm conflicted, and I know that I already had this conversation, but not with Dr. Dominguez present. The definition that you have within your presentation for white supremacism is different than the common definition of what a white supremacist is, especially now. There are groups that are white supremacist groups. And I don't think anybody here would feel that they are part of that. I totally get your definition of white supremacism, but I am still confused about the, you know, the overall, how do you speak to those two different definitions, because they're very different definitions.
Yeah, no, and Kathy, thank you so much for stepping into, I sometimes say stepping into the fire. You know, we say stretch zone, but really sometimes it feels like we're stepping into the fire. And I think it's important for us to pay attention. Like you said, I lost my train of thought. I was thinking, like what's happening to Kathy right now? Like, where did her mind go, right? Because it is challenging for us to consider our heritage, and for you to be really honest and brave about the research that you've done and what you've learned about your family. I appreciate you sharing that with us, and that's exactly, and I'll come to your question, but that's exactly what I really believe that we need to do, because it's very easy for us to, who also have similar histories, right, to think about, man, I probably should not be bringing this up. But if we bring it up, you know, if we put it out there and into the open, and we create spaces where we learn from each other, you know, Kathy, I want to learn about your family, and then I could tell you about my family, and we create, I think probably this structure for that particular conversation is obviously difficult for each one of you to have with each other unless you do it with breakout rooms. But I would say keep going deeper, and hopefully you can all organize a little retreat where you can talk a little bit about your research and what you've learned about your family. But we know that that's what they did at some point in time, right after, and I probably already know this when you did your research, right after 1619, when the first enslaved Africans came to the colonies at that point in time. We also know from history that we had white folks living in proximity, living with Black folks. And, you know, they were sharing work and they were sharing space. And what we started seeing was that white folks, working white folks, and people who were enslaved, Black people who were enslaved, started considering uprising, started considering basically rising up against elite, powerful white groups. And that's when, you know, the elite didn't want that to happen, right? And so they said, you're not them. We'll give you a little bit of land. We'll give you a position of supervision. And just remember, you're not to those enslaved Africans. Divide and conquer, right? And so if we think about this definition of white supremacy, it is not necessarily that, of course, we need to consider, the sin, right? We need to consider what the harm that was done, but we also need to understand what were the sociocultural stressors that your particular family, Kathy, was experiencing that made them feel, you know what? If I separate myself from these enslaved Africans, I'm not going to be tortured, I'm not going to be enslaved, and I'm not going to be abused. So I'll take that. So we have to think about the mechanisms of exploitation, the mechanisms of disposability. And those mechanisms operate in very similar ways. In the United States in particular, we mostly talk about race because that's the way in which the caste system was constructed. But in other countries, it's class. In other countries, it's religion. But it's the same mechanisms: exploitation, disposability, exclusion, eliminability. We want to eliminate you. And so in answer to your question, I think that one of the things that we need to pay attention to is how is it that we try to ally ourselves with dominant groups because we are afraid of being the subjects or the victims of that vulnerability and abuse. And so I do believe that white supremacy is a social structure. I do believe that there are white supremacists and people who are actually inflicting violence. And so when we're talking about white supremacy, simply a structure of violence. When we're talking about white supremacists, it's simply a violent individual. So white supremacist, we're talking about individual. White supremacy, we're talking about the structure. Does that make sense, Kathy?
Well, it makes sense within this frame, but outside, I think that the two terms are not generally widely understood.
Yes. And that's what we need to talk about it, right? Because we need to think about, okay, what do we mean by right wing? What do we mean by fascist? What do we mean by bigot? But because we're not having these conversations, sometimes we don't have common terminology. So if we say we're talking about nationalism, what do we mean by that? What is an anti-fascist? What does that mean? But we're so afraid of having these conversations that we are all coming up with our own theories as to what that might mean. So I would encourage you all to look into White Fragility, Robin DiAngelo's books, and definitely Ibram X. Kendi, because they go a little bit deeper into this. And I see Michael has a question.
Yeah, first off, thank you. That was really informative and very well put together. I have a couple questions. So it feels like this is kind of probably not for you, but this is like the early days of this dialogue taking place in the general white community, and like awareness has started to happen and spread out over the last year. I'm wondering if you are feeling like it's going in a positive direction. Like, are you seeing good things in your classroom? Are you happy with what you're seeing in society in general?
Yeah, yes. And I think that that's what we have to hold on to. I'm a big fan of Angela Davis, and she talks about how the victories that she has seen in the past year or two are victories that she never imagined would happen, not in her lifetime. And so we are at a place where if we really do the work, we can make serious progress. And so I am feeling like I'm hopeful that this new generation, and I've had the opportunity to work with Betsy and Montse Archilla with youth, they are wired differently. I mean, they can tell you the definition of white supremacy. They can tell you what anti-racism is. And I think that that makes me really hopeful that they're getting access to the information. But what does concern me is that in the conversations that I've had with them, it seems like they're searching for this information also kind of on their own. They're downloading books, they're going into social media, following people who identify as folks who are engaged in anti-racist work. but they're not necessarily getting that information in the schools where people are speaking boldly about white supremacy and why it is that 80% of teachers are white and not BIPOC. And so again, you know, we got to tell the truth of why that might be. As a psychologist, I can tell you, like, I'm busy because, and just like our bilingual, bicultural professionals, because there are very few of us out there. And there's a reason why few of us graduate. A lot of us are not coming into the field. So why is that? And in being honest with my students, I have to let them know why I think that is, because admissions criteria are based on traditional notions of Eurocentric success, right? And so I had to say, look, this is the criteria, and this is how you're worthy, and we have to really assess your inner worth, and you will be able to become a clinician. It will be difficult. These are the hoops and challenges that you will experience, and you'll get there. So I think I'm hopeful, but we got to join them in that process as well. So, yeah.
I have a question.
Then,
go ahead.
And then if I could ask a follow-up, referring to the, that baseball image of equality, equity, and liberation.
Yeah.
Where have you gotten on the how of creating and seeing a new system in place, like through your organization and through your education? Like, what are you imagining that to look like?
It's
a big question.
Yeah, it's a huge question. And I think that is where a lot of us are at, right? That when we get requests for these presentations, people are like, please tell us. And we're like, well, there are a few of us doing this work. Like, we got to come together and figure out, how do we create a new system outside of the current order? All that we know is that this order is not working, that people are getting sick, people are dying. You know, look at the COVID infection rates for Black folks and Latinx folks. It's not that we are, you know, we have particular biological, configuration that makes us susceptible to it, right? It's the social determinants of health that impact us. So I think that if we come together and we say, all right, let's create forums where we can envision, we can freedom dream together and think about this new system. How are we going to create a bilingual, bicultural pipeline for teachers? How are we going to create a bilingual, bicultural pipeline for mental health folks? How are we going to encourage BIPOC to come into these leadership positions, to join the mental health board? I see that you're recruiting. How are we going to do that? So all, very few answers, but it's exciting that we are starting to think about it. And we weren't there just a few years ago.
That's great. Thank you.
Of course.
I have a comment and a question here that I want to read out to you, Danny, but I also wanted to chime in terms of the students and the educators. I think that now more than ever, there's a clear divide, and it's super important that we as adults get up to speed where our students are, because we're going to lose them, our youth. We're going to lose our youth, and really that would be at a disadvantage, right? Knowing that I also have teenagers who are my daughters who are here every day, who are talking. I can hear them talking about, oh, my teacher is a racist, for example, or I'm not going to see my therapist because she doesn't or he doesn't understand the situation because they're white. So, I'm being very blunt right now, but those are the conversations I'm hearing from them, and I take them into my work because I feel that's direct experience for me. My second point is there are some questions, Danny, in your presentation. We are going to have a follow-up conversation and at some point to look at our commitments that we outlined with, I'm blanking on her name.
Sarah Rock.
Yeah, Sarah Rock.
Oh,
Thank
Sarah.
you. Yeah, Sarah Rock was the one who did our previous retreat. And so we're going to go back and look at that. And I wonder if we can dive into some of these reflection questions that you posted and dive a little deeper into this conversation on our own. And so then I'll wrap it up here with the question from Sarah. And also, just so you know, Danny, one of your students, Maite, was in the audience earlier today.
Oh, yay.
Yeah.
It's wonderful.
Right? So she says, thank you, Danny. Your work is powerful and profound. As we move through this work, there are leaders of color who are receiving serious racial harassment. For example, today, Jackie Edward, Vice Mayor of Rohnert Park, posted this on Facebook. I understand that in my role as a council member, there will be times that I make decisions that some people in our community will disagree with. It comes with the job. As such, I will always do my best to be accessible to everyone via email or phone, regardless of our differences. You are free to call me and be angry with me. I have thick skin and can take it. However, as happened earlier today, I will not tolerate being told to go back to Africa along with being called the N-word. This is totally unacceptable. Rohnert Park, we can do better. Our leaders of color are not safe in positions of power. What can we do to systemically change this? What is the long-term goal with immediate actions we can take to make the leadership space safer?
Man, and this is usually, you know, what happens, right? And that's the reason why we talk about collective trauma, that in this particular situation, we're talking about a leader in Rohnert Park. But as we hear the story, Black, Indigenous people of color are like, oh man, and something's activated, right? It's I've been there, I've experienced that. And so in thinking about how do we move forward, we need to be about it, and we need to reject white supremacy. So here's where, you know, siblinghood comes in. And here's where we make the calls and say, I got you. And it doesn't have to come from other Black, Indigenous leaders of color. It should come from everybody. How do we make statements that say, you know what, that was not okay? Because we talk about how if we speak up over and over and over again, we create culture. So Sonoma County should be a place in which there should be absolutely no room for behavior like that to happen, right? And that is what actually being an anti-racist is again, not a fixed identity, but engaging in anti-racist work would mean making a call, protesting, speaking up, speaking loudly and boldly, and saying, you know, I stand with my sister. That should have never happened. You're absolutely right. And creating a team of anti-racists, you know, we have to do that. And it hurts my heart that that this has to happen, because if we think about, again, racial trauma, and I realize we're running out of time, we're talking about injuries to the soul. And it's sometimes those injuries are like through microaggressions. So they're like, you know, small lesions, fissures that we might experience. But sometimes it's something like what she experienced, where we're talking about overt racism, overt anti-Blackness that should not be in any way tolerated. And what came up for her, I can't even imagine. So how do we heal? How do we heal? And what is it about also, and I know I'm putting responsibility on the structure on Sonoma County, but what is it about the current structure that makes people feel like they can do that? It just, I don't understand. So we need to say it's absolutely unacceptable and stand with her.
We have a couple more comments, Danny. I know that we're running out of time, but I want to make sure.
Of course. I mean, I'm here, but I know you all have stuff on the agenda, so.
It says, thank you, Dr. Dominguez. Your work is essential, and I will share this presentation with my staff. This was from Elizabeth. And interlink, this is someone specifically, and I'm blanking on the name, but I had the privilege of presenting with this person. Thank you for a great presentation. I appreciate how well you have called out issues, utilized incredible assurance provided by your research. Your voice and sharing others' videos and research. I also appreciate the crucial levels of self-reflection you have invited. This is such a relief, a great beginning. I look forward to sharing the video of this presentation with others when available. And thank you, powerful food for thought, Mary Frances.
Yay. Yes. We're doing the work, people. We're doing the work. And I want to thank you for leaning in. I know a 2-hour presentation is Zoom fatigue, is real. And so thank you to all of you for being here with me and for being in community. I really appreciate it. And anything you need, feel free to reach out to Mana and everybody. I'm here for you. Thank you, everybody.
Gracias a ti, hermana. Thank you so much. This was amazing.
Thank you for your presentation. There are, on the agenda, it did say that there was an opportunity for public comment. Is there anybody that wanted to make a comment? I think that people have done it through the chat room or the chats, but I wanted to be sure to put that out there as being available.
There's a hand.
Bob Cobb.
I noted on the agenda just before the special presentation, there was a spot for indicating appreciation. Did we address that?
I did not, and we were going over. So knowing that Erica had a family emergency that she had to respond to and was not able to be here tonight, I was going to announce, if I had remembered to insert it, that we will appreciate her next month when she's able to be here.
Okay, thank you.
So
Kathy, there's one hand. Yeah.
Okay, so Tori, have you got that hand?
I do believe that hand.
Yes, I've allowed Eric.
Yes,
Yeah,
hello,
Eric
my
can
name.
go ahead and talk.
Hi, my name's Eric Lofgy. I'm the mental health clinical supervisor at Santa Rosa City Schools. And my comment is just simply to appreciate the inclusion of this material in the mental health board's meeting tonight and the importance of looking at the role of social justice, racism, and trauma within the delivery of mental health services cannot be underestimated. And it was really, really a great public service. Thank you.
Your comment. Sherry.
You're muted.
I actually was here listening a lot sooner than my picture came up. I'm not tech savvy. I couldn't figure out how to do it. I finally sent Tori a note, figured out how to do that. Anyway, for my last meeting, I just want to say this was just absolutely awesome. And Kathy, you and I began talking about this a year ago. So it's really, really, really cool that it finally came to be and you guys are going to continue on with it, because just like the last speaker said, this really needs to get into the school system with our kids. And so we can do better now that we know better, just like Maya says.
Well,
Thank you for Sherry. Thank you for your long dedication to the mental health board. We'll miss you.
Yeah,
absolutely.
my pleasure. Well, I'll still be chiming in here when I can.
Great.
You know, I'm paying attention.
We hope to see a lot of you.
Thanks. Me too.
Okay, anybody else? Michael.
Yeah, I think it was a really good presentation, and I think I am left with and feel, I'm sure we all are, that there's a lot of work to be done, and I hope we remain hopeful and diligent in that work.
I'm going to be asking Tori to send out a doodle poll to see when we can get together for a retreat. And we will discuss all three presentations we've had, because the county presentation was also pretty extraordinary. So we've had three strong presentations, and now we have to figure out what to do with them. So thank you very much, Dr. Dominguez, for your presentation. Okay. If there's no further questions, I'll entertain oh my gosh, my brain is not working. I'll entertain a motion to adjourn. There we go.
Motion to adjourn.
There's Bob, there's Michael. Okay. All in favor? I'm not going to call on everybody. Anybody opposed? Okay. We are done. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kathy.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Sherry.
Stay well.
Excellent program.